some reason I lost the camera. So starting off again, you see, because I've chopped this up slightly, you can see the middle leg isn't even touching the table. You see it's all just hovering above it. If this post for any reason got ever so slightly shorter, it would transfer a huge amount of weight to the back post. Let me explain. Most buildings are a series of beams and columns, and the horizontal beams are simply connected to the columns, at joints. Those joints don't need to be particularly rigid, so any movement in the structure, any settling in the structure simply causes the joints to flex slightly, which means the weight is still on the columns, because, you know, if a column sags, the girders just give a little bit and the whole building is still sitting on that column the way it should do. When you have an incredibly rigid beam across 3 columns, any settling of any of the columns will transfer a huge amount of weight to the other 2. This beam is exceptionally rigid for a building structure. So any shortening of the center column, you know, when they cut that column, they would have put a gap in it, and then they would have chopped the gap with wedges, because that's a standard demolition industry technique to make sure that when the building comes down, it all separates apart safely. Now, this particular building, the main beam was only connected at the center column. The ends were simply rested there, like they do at Stonehenge. The cross beams simply sit on top of the columns. It's a building technique that they've been using for centuries and eons. It's even the vast 4th rail bridge, you know, only the center tower is connected to its foundations, and the others are just sat on it to allow the building to expand, the bridge to expand and contract. And let me see if I can find a better picture. And I had one. I hope it's here. Actually, I should have thought to dig it out, check it out, and dig it out earlier. It's the shows the detail of the end of the beam where it sits on. There it is. Go on, computer, bring it up. There it is. There's the beam, and there's the column. And by pure coincidence, this is the actual beam we're talking about. This is the one that actually went there. It's the one that came at the exact thing we're talking about. So when we're looking at the broken off end of the building, the column we're looking at is that actual one. And I know because in the pictures, visible is that shed, which was a little shed they put up to give the workmen a break. It was so ferociously hot up there that they put a little air cooler and a water cooler, an air conditioner and a water cooler, just to give the people a break. Now that shed is clearly visible in the broken off end of the building, so that's the beam we're actually talking about. It's rested on a resting pad. So what you've got is a resting pad and a beam sitting on the end of it. When you look at the picture, you see it's not connected. It's not connected, so there was no reason for the demolition company to cut that column all the way round, because it was just going to part company. So the only column they had to cut really was the one in the middle. However, if it had settled even by the smallest amount, the beam that went across it was so massive and so rigid because of its depth of structural it was this computer's being a pain, stop it. It was so deep in cross section that even the slightest bit of settling in the middle column would have transferred significant amounts of weight to the front and back columns. The workmen clearly did their job well. The people who cut the steel did it very accurately. You know, I can see cuts there, they are perfectly straight. The angled bit I showed you earlier, the angle is perfect. So the workmen did their job right. As far as I can tell as a layperson, the workmen did their job right. They didn't just go hacking around. They did the job right. So it's not the workmen who messed up. Here's a closer view of the center column, and you can see all the angles where they cut it. That was deliberate to allow it to all slide apart when the thing was dynamited. The workmen did their job right. So you might think, surely the engineer who designed the cutting plan did the job right. Coleman's have been around a long time, and you look on YouTube and you watch Coleman buildings coming down, and they all come down just perfectly. In fact, when you watch YouTube videos of demolitions, you find that actually the Coleman buildings are the ones that actually probably come down the best of all. Colemans know what they're doing. Despite whatever frustrated rants people, including me, may have had about them in the heat of emotion in earlier months, they're actually, far as I can tell, they know what they're doing. I mean, you know, they do know what they're doing. Incidentally, I can see the foot plate of that girder is bent. It's slightly buckled, and there's a massive dent there. That's because the girder in question is just under where my finger is, and all of these pipes and stuff have gone past it and have bashed it. That tells me that when the top structure came down, it didn't fall away completely. It came across and then it went down, because as it went down, that stuff went past. So that actually tells me the direction this beam went when it came apart. So the workmen did the job right, bless them. The engineer must have done their job right, because they're inexperienced engineers. They know what they're doing. Remember this column? Very strong, it can take my weight. Well, what you're looking at here, what you're looking at there is the top of the column that held the end of the beam, and it's collapsed. And I'm looking for that previous picture again I had on the computer, and it's the end of the beam. It collapsed. Let me show you something. The beam supported the structure, and these girders are part of that structure, and everything hung off those girders. It was really almost an upside down building. The weight is just amazing. Picture I'm looking at's there. There's that column, strong and true. There's the very same column as it happens, and you can see it's all bent up. Let me show you what you're actually looking at. What they've done is the sides are still intact. There was no reason to completely sever the column, because it was not really connected to the structure. It was going to part company when the building came down. It was all just going to come to pieces like that. To make sure it actually came down, though, they did pre-weaken it. They cut all the way down, they cut across the bottom, and they cut up again. Let's get that right. Down, across, up on both sides. Down, across, up on this other side as well. So what you're looking at is that. There's the end of the beam going away from you, and there's the column. What's happened is that some proceedings, the weld there has broken on the inside there, broken there, and the side has caved in. And what you're looking at is that. When you look at the pictures, you're looking at the side that's come out here, and the whole thing is bent over, and that's bent inwards. There's a curve there. Sorry, there's a curve on this bit. This bit's curved in, and the thing is sitting over the top of it. That's what you're looking at. Let me see if I can find another picture of it. It's I think it's there. There it is. I don't know if you can make that out, but that thing there, that thing where my finger is the top of that column all mangled up, and I can just see the side of it going backwards, because what's happened is the side, as the thing has come down, the side has rotated around and now pointing out the back like that. That side is actually bent, so it's had load on it. So that implies they didn't just cut around. What they did was they cut it, and then standard demolition technique, they wedged it. They had that wedge, all wedged and chopped and solid. So it's still solid, even though they've cut it, because they've wedged it. Remember what I said earlier about the center column getting slightly shorter, because it might have settled because they cut all the way around it? They didn't cut around the back column. They didn't touch the front column. The front column there is absolutely solid. There's nothing wrong with it. They never touched it. So what's happening is the beam, if the middle column, and this is pure speculation, if the chocks, the wedges had slipped out of the middle column, and I can tell that that area there where they cut it has sustained no mechanical damage. Where they cut it, it's as they cut it. Here's a picture of it there. You know, there it is there. They cut it round very nicely, and there is no, you know, there's a tab of metal sticking up there where they cut round it. That tab is sticking up. It hasn't been damaged. Nothing has hit that structure. Nothing has bashed it. So the beam has come away and then fallen down. So if the wedge has slipped out of there, you know, the middle beam was not suffered as a result of the collapse. Let me show you something. Here's a beam, solid. I could put my weight on that. Here's the identical structure. And here's the identical structure. And I'm looking for a little bit of plastic which I've mislaid. There it is. There's the identical structure, and it's got the resting pad on top that the beam used to sit on. You know, I've seen that close up. The whole beam used to sit on this resting pad. And then, so what you're looking at with that thing bent over, you can almost see the resting pad there. You can just make up the shadow of the edge of it. So it's kind of bent round like so. Look at this. I could still put quite a lot of pressure on that. But you might notice that as I push harder and harder, you see I'm struggling to keep it steady. You see, as I push really hard on it, the problem I'm having is that it wants to go sideways all the time. You see that? I'm not doing, I'm actually trying to keep it still, but it's popping out sideways and sideways. I wonder if that's what caught them out. Because the engineer did their job properly, they did the calculations, that was strong enough to take the weight straight down. You know, it was all going according to plan, but sideways. There is no lateral stability in that at all. That moves so easily sideways. It really does move with the slightest of effort. Now this is pure speculation, and it's only for people to have something to go on while the official report comes out. You know, when the official report comes out, you can throw this video in the bin and read that, but until the official report comes out, this is just something to go at. So this is just pure theory. The whole top frame was sitting on pre-weakened, you know, like this. The other column that was this side of the frame, which went down with it, was probably the same. And again, speculation, it moves sideways terribly, terribly easily. So this whole top frame, you know, there was less pressure on the middle column because it might well have settled. You know, you cut through a massive steel column and then you drive those little wedges in. Compared to the massive pressure acting on it, those wedges would have squished slightly. You know, the whole thing would have kind of settled down. But because the beam was so incredibly rigid, very unusually rigid, much more so than you'd find in any other kind of building, it kind of took the weight off the middle column and transferred it onto the back one. So all the calculations done for the pre-weakening have not taken into account the fact that this column is now carrying more weight than it was supposed to. Here's where I start to take off into the land of guesswork. One of the columns, probably the one on the other side of the boiler. Let's get this out of the way. This frame is what's left of Unit 2. That's Unit 3's frame. There will be another one there, identical. This is one end of it. The opposite column to this is kind of over here somewhere. And the whole top frame, sitting on that column, has been moving from side to side because it had no lateral stability. It had the ability to move from side to side. It lost its connection with the middle column, so now the whole back end of it is sitting on this wobbly bit. And it's just gone like so. If you look at the roof, although it's sagging and fallen down in places, a lot of it is still staying up, even though there's no support under it. If the beam had come straight down, it would have pulled all that down with it. What it's actually done is it's gone sideways and it's ripped itself away. The roof is torn apart like the deck of the Titanic. Now, from that point on, I can't read because I'm working on incomplete information. Can't really say much more than that what happened. Many of the columns had a wedge cut in the base, and the wedge was left joined at a point which was going to be cut with the blast. When they set off the cutting charges, the metal would be severed, and because it was pre-cut at an angle, the column would slide inwards off the stub that's on the ground, and that would cause the whole lot frame thing to come across and drop down, and the whole building would be like that. It would just basically fold up like a deck chair. Question: because it was overloaded, one possible failure scenario is that that wedge simply broke and the column went bang like that. Now, the huge frame is like this, sitting on the top of that column, and this end of it has been stopped on top of the column, and when the column dropped, the frame dropped and it went bang like that. So it dropped, it found the ground, the column, which is now shorter, landed on the ground and tried to stop this frame. The shock of it falling finished off the pre-weakening at this end, and that whole lot came apart, and this came down like so. Meanwhile, this column, which is over there, by the way, has gone bang like that. Now, if you watch, when I hit the ground with it, you see it bend. You see that? It's dropped and it's gone bang. See it? See the bend? This is kind of slow motion. As it's come down, it's pushed outwards like that. Unit 2 fell, and as it did so, it slammed against Unit 1, and all of the Unit 1 columns, because they're still connected to this one with cross girders, all of the Unit 1 columns felt that collision, and because they had also been pre-weakened, they broke. So the Unit 1 columns actually folded up. And I'm looking for an aerial shot, but the aerial shot, you see that Unit 2 is kind of crumpled straight down. Unit 1 is kind of burst outwards. And I can actually see one of the supporting columns, you won't see it on the picture, sitting right on top of the wreckage. As the structure came down, the column burst its way up through it, and when everything landed on the floor, the column just went boink like that. And that is clearly sitting on the wreckage. If you get to see close-up pictures of the original collapse, you'll see it just there like a giant matchstick. So, two things happened. It either shifted weight onto the back because the column settled in the middle, because the wedges settled, because of the huge forces involved, or this very unstable arrangement here allowed the thing to move sideways. And the engineers, when they did their calculations, were thinking about the weight of it all acting straight down, because that's still quite strong, pushing straight down. The problem is that it is very not strong going from side to side. It is extremely floppy going from side to side, and it's kind of gone like this. The weld here has broken, and so the weld on the side there has broken, and the whole thing has gone like that. And what you're looking at in the wreckage is this side panel poking out the back, that bent over at the joint there, and this plate here on the side pushed in. I'm getting to the point now with incomplete information that I'm starting to move from science to speculation, so I've come to the point where I probably really need to stop. So here's the building. This thing, for some reason, which I won't speculate on too much, has allowed itself to move, and it has come off the front and it has come down, and from what I can tell, but again this is only layman's guessing, is that it started to come down at the back a bit like so, and then went that way, and it's gone into the wreckage and it's crashed down like this. So in the rubble pile, it's sort of in that position. And then the top frame of Unit 1, the top steel as it's called, has landed top of it with its corner overlapping the one that came down from Unit 2. Sorry, the Unit 1. Unit 2 came down first, Unit 1 came over on top of it. So, from what I can tell, the way that it came loose is it's come down at this end first and then got away. So the structure has moved, waggled itself free, and possibly fallen at the far end first, and as the structure is tilted, it's put pressure on that weld which has broken it and pushed everything over. Only the official inquiry will be able to really ascertain what happened from that point on, but you know, this is just to point ordinary lay people in the right direction of having some understanding about how that building was built and how it may have come apart. These old power stations are going to disappear from our skyline as new technology takes over. Indeed, our house here has a boiler that not only generates heat but generates electricity as well. Our gas boiler makes a kilowatt of electricity. That's we're one of the first to have one. And that's possibly the future of power generation. So these big old school structures are probably going to disappear as new technology takes over. The result of that is that one of the reasons why I made this video is not only to explain what went wrong, but also to kind of record for posterity the kind of essence of what it was like inside one from the point of view of somebody who actually worked in one. Yeah. I'll keep pushing the couch back by mistake. Here's a beam I made earlier. Oops. And it's got 3 legs on it. Because it's so stiff, any settling of the middle leg basically causes the weight of the beam to come right off it. So it might as well not be there. So now the middle leg, which was the strongest of the 3, is now not carrying any weight, and it's put the weight on the ones at each end, one of which has been pre-weakened with this business. And I'm kind of going over the ground that I went over earlier, but that's the basic idea. Most people don't realise that steel really does get a huge amount of its strength from the way that it's assembled together. You know, bricks and concrete are inherently rigid, but steel isn't. Steel is inherently flexible. It becomes rigid because of the way it's assembled and braced. Think of a Coke can, a tin, or a baked bean tin. The metal's very thin, but you can stand on the baked bean tin and it may or may not collapse, even though it's very thin metal. But if you put a vertical cut in the side of a baked bean tin or a Coke can and then stand on it, it will collapse. Now, this pre-weakening would have been scientifically designed to ensure that when the dynamite went off, that also collapsed, so you didn't end up with a building rigid and strong. It might topple over a bit and it's still in one piece and you've got a massive headache and everyone's laughing at you. You really do want it to fall apart. And but I really find myself asking the question, you know, did they take into account the extreme loss of lateral stability? The wedges, which are a standard demolition technique, are jammed in the gaps, but they're jammed in under the anticipation that the weight is straight down. They cut the metal and they put the wedges in, so the wedges take over the role of the metal in handling the forces acting straight down. The problem is this doesn't want to go straight down, it wants to go sideways. And I wonder, ultimately, was that the mistake? And, you've got the feel for the people involved, but if it was the mistake, then it's very, very sad. And, it's put my mind at rest as to what may have gone wrong, and it'll put my mind at rest for now until the official report comes out. And then once the official report comes out, you can basically throw this video away and go what the official report says. But a lot of people aren't going to see the official report. A lot of people aren't going to ever get around to reading it. They're not going to ever get around to, plowing through it. Their life is too short. They've got better things to do than to be forever reading through very tedious, multi-worded 2,000-page documents and all the rest of it. It's just damned hard work. So, I hope this gives a reasonable guide, and maybe when the official report does come out, I will make an updated video explaining the differences between what I thought might have happened and what actually happened. And then I'll keep this video, and I'll keep a copy of this video, and then when the official report comes out, I will make a bit to go on the end, and an edit and add it to the end to give the whole story, because at the moment I'm only a layperson operating on incomplete information, so I can only go so far as to what may have happened. But I do find this business of the sideways flex extremely illuminating. I really can't help but wonder if that was the cause, the fact that they were simply caught out by the whole thing just not going down, but floaty sideways. If I push down the hard of that as hard as I can, I really am having a job keeping it in position. It really is trying very hard to go sideways. And the harder I push down, the more unstable it gets. And because there may have been extra force on that, because the middle column may have shortened, because they cut all the way around it to put the wedges in, and they didn't cut all the way around this one, that beam was so rigid that even the slightest bit of shortening of the center column would have significantly increased the load on the front and back columns. There's the beam there. Let's say that's the beam. Now, I would like to know how much force, extra force, would be generated if the beam sagged. So, what I'm trying to say is this. There's your beam. If the middle of the beam, if the middle column settled by just 1 centimeter, the thickness of my finger, if the actual beam in the power station, if the middle column settled by just the width of my finger, that huge beam would want to bend to take up the fact that the middle column has moved away from it. What I would like to do is to get an engineer with a PhD to give the dimensions of the beam to, and ask them to work out what that extra force would be. But again, it's only a layman's thing, because I'm sure the official investigation will do the same thing. They'll think, okay, if the center column settled, how much extra force did it put on the front and back columns? So I know the cross section of the beam. I know how big. It's actually that shape. It's 16 feet by 4. I've seen the drawings. So think of 2 8x4 sheets of plywood stacked, one on top of the other. That's the shape it is. It's that's the shape of the beam. It's 16 feet tall by 4 feet wide. So that's the shape of it. And there's a welded seam down the middle because it's made of 2 plates joined together. And there it is there. At the end of the station there was a staircase running past there. When I stood level at the bottom of the beam, my outstretched hand came to about there. I couldn't even touch the seam that was halfway up. It was huge and very, very stiff, and I can tell how thick the metal is because of the bottom plate there. So I will work out some dimensions. I will write a letter to an engineering friend and ask them to do a few calculations, because he's probably got a computer program that would do it in 5 minutes, and work out that if the middle of the beam sagged by 1 centimetre, the thickness of that, how much extra load it would put on the back columns, back and front column. In other words, if the beam is floating weightlessness in zero gravity, how much force will I need to put on it to get the middle of it to bend by just 1 centimetre? That's what I want to know. I could look it up if I was researching in the internet and all that, because I kind of probably know enough about it. But it would be nice to ask a friend with a PhD, simply because I can then say there's a friend with a PhD who worked this out. Because when you don't have a PhD, people don't really want to listen. You know, it doesn't matter if you're very familiar to building and have a Fred Dibner-like appreciation of engineering. You know, the PhD sounds good. And so if I can get someone with an official qualification to do a simple beam strength calculation, it would satisfy my curiosity as to what extra force would have gone onto that column. Basically, the force manifested by the simple act of bending that huge beam by 1 centimetre. That's what I want to know. Basically, how stiff it is in engineering terms. This thing, the top steel as it was called, everything hung off it, had huge girders going across from side to side. You know, there's the girder going across from side to side, and there's another one behind it. And then there were hundreds of cross pieces, and those cross pieces had rods threaded through them, and there was a whole forest of rods that came down, and the boiler, everything on the boiler was hung off that forest of rods. You know, you can even see a pair of rods there, you probably can't in the picture, holding up a pipe. And gave you some idea of how it worked. I want to, just for this curiosity's sake, you know, I've kind of gone as far as I want to go with trying to explaining the collapse. There's the top of the frame, see the girders going across, and these nuts are the tops of rods going down, and there's a whole sea of rods to hold the boiler up. Incidentally, there's a thick square washer under each of those nuts to spread the load onto the channel beams. In America, they had a suspended walkway in a hotel, the Hyatt Regency, was it the Kansas Hyatt, where there was a packed event that night. The whole foyer was packed. People had crowded onto the overhead walkways, and two of them, one suspended under the other, collapsed. One of the reasons why is they hadn't used those washers as such. They simply had the nut resting straight on the channel iron, and it caused 200 odd people to lose their lives. It was more involved than that, but it's just an interesting point. You know, here they've done it properly with a nice thick square block of metal to transfer the intense point contact pressure of the rod onto the channel beam. And but what you're looking at there, all of that, is what's been replicated kind of very crudely on this. And there's the roof of the station, there's the top steel as it was called, and what you're looking at is you're basically looking across the top of the... It's an impressive structure. The whole boiler house structure, the complete thing, you know, weighed in the same order of weight as the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. You know, you're talking about a serious lot of steel work. So basically what Coleman's were doing is we're demolishing a structure equivalent in magnitude to the Twin Towers. And so, you know, that was a big job. And they so nearly pulled it off. You got to feel sad, you know, poor old Coleman's, you know, and the workers and the people who died and the families, waiting to get those bodies out of the making of this film. You know, they're still in there. They're still in the blooming wreck. You know, it's all very emotional stuff, really. And, you know, you got emotions flying about and you want to know what's going on. So, you know, it's nice to have some idea of the science. It's nice, you know, when you're asking questions, it's never nice not knowing. So, you know, hopefully by putting some effort into explaining what happened, it kind of helps people find some sort of closure and understanding of what went wrong. And even just the people of Didcot and the wider engineering community, you know, they may be very skilled engineers in their own field, but they've never seen inside a power station. They're thinking, you know, how the blooming heck did that happen? And at least this has given some idea of what may have gone wrong. And you know, you look at that huge beam, that huge structure, and you think, how on earth do they get it up there? You know, the craneage and the engineering and the enterprise and the ingenuity just to put the thing together. It's actually a very simple structure. The people who built Stonehenge would understand how this structure went together. They would understand the basic principles. You know, it's just beams and columns. As structures go, it was actually quite simple. It was just done on an absolutely massive scale. Had to be strong, had to be resilient, had to be flexible. You probably wouldn't want to make it out of concrete because you'd have to use an awful lot of concrete, not simply to get the strength, but to get the flexibility. Those boilers had huge fires in them, and the fires, you know, wouldn't just burn smoothly like a gas flame on a stove. It would, you know, the whole building would shake. It would rattle spanners off the table. It was just, and I'm just typing something in here into YouTube. And just a bit overshadowed by the fact that there's so many, but I'm just going to bring this video up now, and there's the view in the corner door of one of the boilers. This is a video I put up some years ago. Just look it up on Didcot Power Station. That's one of the boilers just starting to warm up, and it's got the flames going, and they're gas flames. They'd warm it up on gas and then they'd burn the coal, and the coal would be blown in, but it didn't burn as smoothly as gas. Everything used to shake and rattle and bang and thump, and the whole thing was just hammering and shaking and vibrating away. So this steel frame had to be damn rigid and strong and resilient, because basically it had to put up with 40 odd years of King Kong jumping up and down on it. It was a good solid piece of engineering, and of course that explains why they thought that they had to do a great deal of pre-weakening to it just to make sure the thing would actually come apart, because it was immensely strong. I mean, stupidly strong. And you know, the beam that I've been talking about is bigger than the main girder rails of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You know, I've been on the Harbour Bridge. I've had been on tours on it. I've been over it many times on holidays in Australia, and you know, it's the biggest beam in Didcot Power Station was bigger than the biggest beam on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and you know, the bridge, the Sydney Bridge, the boiler structures alone in the power station, you know, the Titanic, they all weighed about the same. You know, the Titanic, everything. You know, the boiler house structures alone probably weighed as much as well, they did as much as the Titanic. So this is big stuff. And so, you know, one of the reasons why I made this is basically as a kind of living testament to a really most remarkable thing. And you know, it's, and of course the terrible sadness of what in the end happened to it. And I do hope this video kind of helps everyone involved, gives some insight into the behaviour and nature of the building. For instance, you can see that if I support this by one corner, you can see it's twisted because it's surprisingly flexible and twist. And